We're in the middle of a series called Stories of the Cross. And when we usually think of the cross, we think of the story of Jesus. But this series is a reminder that there was many other individuals whose their personal stories were also wrapped up with that cross event. People such as Judas or Pilate or Peter, or in this case today, we're going to be talking about Barabbas. And to start us off, what I thought we could do is just read right through the story, at least as far as Matthew's account is concerned. The story of Barabbas sort of spills out over into Mark, Luke, and John. And to get all the details, you kind of have to look at all of those together. But we're going to read it right through in Matthew, and then we're going to unpack it together. And at the end of that, we're going to have our communion service together. We'll be washing one another's feet and having the bread and the grape juice, these symbols that Jesus has given us to remind us of the amazing thing that he did for us upon the cross. And so grab your Bible, or you've got those nice turquoise ones there as well. So Matthew chapter 27, and we're going to start in verse 11. So it says this: Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him the message, "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." "Why, what crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." All the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So here's this man Barabbas. On this particular day, he began the day in prison, without hope, without a future, and only a fearful, cruel Roman punishment to look forward to. But now, this man Barabbas is free. Now this man has a second chance. Now this man has life. All because Jesus took his place. Now, there's a few things that really stand out to me about this story, and a few things that were new when I researched this story, and I want to share those with you. And the first one is this: both Jesus and Barabbas were accused of the same crime. Now let me share with this first. We'll look at Jesus. This is what they accused Jesus of. So this is in Luke's account. It says, "And they began to accuse him, saying, 'We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king.'" And a little bit later on, Pilate would say these words, "You brought me this man as one who is inciting the people to rebellion." And so the accusation that the religious leaders brought to Pilate about Jesus was that he was a rebel against Rome. Now, there's a whole lot of things that these religious leaders hated about Jesus. There's a lot of things that offended them about Jesus, but they chose this because in the Roman Empire, the quickest way to get someone killed was to make them appear like a threat to the society and to the government. And so they painted Jesus as much as they could as someone who was an enemy of Rome and a rebel. He's subverting the nation. He's inciting rebellion. He claims that he is a king. So that's Jesus, the rebel. So now let's look at Barabbas. Now in Mark chapter 15 and verse 7, it describes Barabbas like this. It says, a man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. Now, insurrection is just a word that refers to a revolt against the sort of established government. And so apparently from this verse, there had been some kind of organized revolt against the Romans. And this was a specific revolt. It simply refers to it as the uprising. And Barabbas was caught up in this. People's lives had been lost. And not only Barabbas, but apparently there were others as well who were also caught up with this and were in prison on that day. So both Jesus and Barabbas both were accused of the same crime. The second interesting fact that I learnt in this is that both of them, both Jesus and Barabbas, actually had the same name. Did you pick that up when we read through in Matthew? Let me read to you just the verse that we read just before in Matthew. So it says, at that time they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. Now it doesn't include that first part of his name in Mark, Luke, or John. And some of the manuscripts even leave it out, but there's good reasons to believe that this was what Matthew actually originally wrote, that his full name was Jesus Barabbas. And so when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, which do you want me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah? So here we literally have two rebels that Pilate brings before the crowd, two Jesuses. There's Jesus Barabbas and Jesus the Messiah. And he's like, which Jesus do you want me to release to you? Now, so there was a lot of things that were actually in common between these two men. But there was one very significant detail that was different. Jesus the Messiah was innocent. In fact, everyone could see that Jesus was innocent. His innocence was like radiating out from him. And Pilate could see this. He had had so many criminals come through his court, and he knew what a guilty criminal looked like. But Jesus carried himself with a dignity and a poise and an innocence unlike anyone that he'd ever seen before him. He saw these people accusing Jesus of all these different types of things and hurling all sorts of abuse at Jesus, and Jesus said not even a single word in response to them. He had no retaliation. He didn't try to defend himself. He simply just held himself there with that dignity. And I think that when Barabbas came to that platform on that day and he saw himself compared to Jesus, he saw in some ways an equal, but he saw someone completely opposite to him. And I imagine when he saw that they were choosing between him and Jesus the Messiah, his heart must have sank, because he knew that, of course, everyone would choose Jesus the Messiah to be released. Just look at the difference. And so it must have taken a while for those words to really sink into his heart when he heard the crowd cry out, Barabbas! Release to us Barabbas! And have Jesus crucified. So there's interesting fact number 2 that had the same name. And here's interesting fact number 3. It is likely that Jesus actually died on Barabbas's cross. Now you might be wondering, how on earth did I arrive at that conclusion? Well, remember when we think about the Jesus dying on the cross, one of the interesting things in the story is that you read about Jesus going to trial, and then eventually it comes to his crucifixion, and then suddenly there's these 2 other men that are there with him getting crucified as well. Now, we usually refer to these people as thieves, because some of the translations refer to them as thieves, but the word thief can also be translated as rebel. And so in Mark 15, verse 27, it says they crucified 2 rebels with him, with Jesus, one on his right and on his left. Now, where did these people come from? Well, we just read before in Mark chapter 15 that Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists, plural. So apparently on that morning there was a number of rebels, of these people that had done some sort of uprising against Rome, that were in prison. And the most likely outcome for you if you were a rebel that was caught in the Roman Empire was death. And they had this really awful thing called crucifixion that they had invented to put the fear of the Romans in anyone that might think of going against them. And so it's quite likely that these 2 other men were 2 of these other so-called insurrectionists that were there in prison that morning as well. Barabbas probably knew these two people as well. They were probably his companions. And another interesting detail is that people have noticed in the story of Jesus is just how quick the crucifixion is organized. Like Jesus is arrested on the Thursday night, and then he has this kind of a mock of a trial before the Jewish authorities in the middle of the night. Then they drag him off to Pilate in the morning, and by 9 a.m., Jesus is hanging up there on the cross. How did it all happen so quickly? Well, this makes people think that maybe, quite likely, they were already planning on a crucifixion that morning. A crucifixion of those two men that hung on either side of Jesus, and a crucifixion of Barabbas as well. Here's a couple of things that some commentators have said on this fact. It says, in the Expositor's Bible Commentary, it says, the fact that 3 crosses were prepared strongly suggests that Pilate had already ordered the preparations be made for the execution of the 3 rebels. If so, Jesus the Messiah actually took the place of the rebel Jesus, Barabbas. And then in another book, The 4 Faces of Jesus, it says, crucifixion would be the near automatic fate of an insurrectionist, and thus it appears quite likely that a crucifixion of 3 men on the charge of insurrection was already planned for the day that Jesus was brought to Pilate. The ironic thing then is that the cross on which Jesus died was prepared for somebody else. He died on the cross on which Barabbas should have died. And then a short quote from the book Desire of Ages. It says, as Jesus passed the gate of Pilate's court, the cross which had been prepared for Barabbas was laid upon his bruised and bleeding shoulders. Jesus died on Barabbas's cross. Just let that sink in. When Barabbas looked at the cross, what did he see? Firstly, I think when he looked at those 2 crosses on left and right, he saw people that he would have known, people that were involved in the same thing that he was, that were dying a rebel's death, bleeding and in pain and agony on the cross. But when he looked at that middle cross, he saw the cross that he should be hanging on. He saw Jesus experiencing the pain that he should be experiencing. He saw Jesus held there with his nails. And when he looked down at his hands, he saw that he was free. He had a second chance. He had life because Jesus had died literally for him upon his cross in his place. What do you see when you look at the cross? Because the reality is that we can see the same thing. When we look at that cross, we see Jesus dying the death that we deserve. Like Barabbas, our story begins with us in prison to sin and the situation of sin, without hope and without a future. But Jesus, because he loves us so much, chose to step into our place. And as a result of that, if we choose to accept that, we can also have that forgiveness and freedom and life eternal. And so this morning, as we wash each other's feet and we have the bread and the grape juice, I want this idea to inspire your hearts as you try to wrestle with what actually does the cross mean for you? What did Jesus do for you upon that cross? And what impact is that having upon your life right now? And so we're going to wash each other's feet. Now, the reason we do this is because we are reenacting the last meal that Jesus had with his disciples before his death. And we do this because Jesus asked us to do this. And there's 3 symbols. There's the foot washing. So on that night, they had everything prepared, but they forgot to organize someone to wash their feet. And Jesus said, you know what? I'm going to wash everyone's feet. And so he gets up and he washes all of his disciples' feet as a way of showing them that in Jesus' kingdom, greatness is not about power or position or status. It's about service. And so Jesus said, as I've washed your feet, I want you to now to wash one another's feet. And so today we're going to wash one another's feet to remind us that God's kingdom is about giving and God's kingdom is about service. And then when we finish that, we're going to come back together and we are going to eat the bread and the grape juice and really reflect on the significance of what Jesus has done on the cross for us. So we've been talking about how the story of Barabbas is our story. So here's Barabbas. This man who started the day in chains, without hope, without a future, and he finishes the day forgiven, free, and with the rest of his life to look forward to because Jesus had taken his place. And in a similar way, this is our story as well. Because we began this situation with sin, without hope, without a future, but Jesus came to this world and he took our place and he died upon our cross so that we can be free and we can be forgiven and we can have eternal life. And so as we eat the bread and the grape juice, the bread here is a symbol of Jesus' body that was broken for us upon the cross, and the grape juice is a symbol of Jesus' blood that was spilt for us in our place upon the cross. And Jesus has invited us to from time to time to eat these symbols and drink these symbols as a way of making fresh in our minds the reality of what Jesus has done for us. And so in a moment I'm going to invite you to come up the front to do that. And I really want to encourage you just to have some time of reflection. You might want to have it as whisper or have a silent prayer to God while you're doing this. You might want to reaffirm your commitment to Jesus and your acceptance of everything he's given you as a result of the cross. Or you might want to just reflect on the incredible love that Jesus has for you. And the way we're going to do this is we're not going to all do this in unison. We're going to have Michelle's going to play for us some music. And we're just going to come up to the front and grab a piece of bread and grape juice and take it back to your seat. And then as you feel led, just eat and drink, reflect, sit there, listen to the music, and no pressure, Michelle. And just reflect on what this feels. And then when everyone has done that, we've had a bit of time, then we'll have our final song and prayer. And in the white bowls, that's gluten-free. So if you're gluten-free, there's an option for you up the front as well. And so I want to just read for you one final Bible passage. And I really want you to just let these words go to your heart as we do this final part of our service. It says, in Isaiah, this is a prophecy speaking about Jesus. It says, "Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all."